Always look on the bright side of life. Always look on the light side of...
Okay, so far we've looked at work as a cause of stress and hassles and uplifts, and the last cause we're going to look at is a lack of control. Now, we obviously can find ourselves in lots of situations, but how much control you have over the situation can affect how stressful you find it. So, for example, living near noisy neighbours can be stressful. I can guarantee I used to live near a very noisy pub, and when they played music very late at night, it was quite stressful, particularly for my husband, who couldn't sleep through it. Now, researchers suggested it's not just the noise itself that's causing us stress, but it's the fact that we don't have control over it. We can't just go and turn it off when we want, and that makes it more stressful. Okay, so is it that having little control over a situation makes it more stressful? And recently this has become a more popular idea. So recent theories of stress have really emphasised self-control as important in understanding stress. Okay, and we're just going to look at 3 brief examples of that before we look at a study at where the lack of control does affect stress levels. So the 3 theories that it relates to are self-efficacy, which we've looked at before, hardiness, and feelings of mastery. So self-efficacy, we looked at this before when we were thinking about health promotion and health behaviours, but here we're thinking about it obviously in relation to stress. So you know that the idea of self-efficacy is how much you believe you can do something, perform a particular behaviour. And they thought that Lazarus and Folkman thought it was actually a powerful factor in mediating the stress response. So if you say, I am confident that I can succeed in this exam, if you really believe that and you hold that belief, that can actually reduce the stress levels, okay, the stress response going on. Okay, so that can be physiological, so physical changes, and reduce the stress response if you genuinely believe you can do well in an exam. That exam is going to cause you less stress. Okay, so if you believe you can control your own behaviour, okay, that is going to affect how stressful that subsequent situation makes you feel. Okay, the more you believe you have the ability to do well, you have the ability to control something, the less stressful that situation is going to make you feel. Another kind of similar concept is hardiness. So this was put forward by Cabasa, and hardiness has different factors. It reflects personal feelings of control, a desire to accept challenges, and commitment. And your degree of hardness is kind of on a continuum. So the more hardy you are, okay, influences how you perceive potential stressors, so not necessarily stress, but potential stressors, and therefore the resulting stress response. So the more hardy you are as an individual, okay, the less stressed you are going to be by potential stressors. The third concept is mastery. So this was by Karasek and Theorel in 1990, and it's about your individual's control specifically over the stress response. So self-efficacy and hardiness weren't specifically related to stress, whereas this is. So they thought that the degree of mastery can be related to the stress response. Sorry. Okay, so according to all of those ideas, those theories, stress is a product of how much self-control you have over a situation. Okay, so if you believe you have high levels of control, okay, so if you've got high capacity for self-control, then you've got lots of coping strategies, you've got management, you've got ways of managing the stress, and so it eradicates the stress. If those strategies fail, then you get a stress response. Okay, so stress-related illness is a consequence of failed self-management. So you've got that lack of self-control, or that perceived lack of control, and therefore you get stressed, therefore you get ill. Okay, so is there actually any experimental evidence for lack of control as a cause of stress? So the key study here is Geer and Meisel, so 1972. So again, this study is 40 years old, 41 years old now, so it's quite an old study. But what they wanted to do is see if perceived control, okay, or actual control can reduce stress reactions to aversive stimuli. Aversive means unpleasant. And in this case, it was photos of crash victims, so car crash victims. Obviously, the image on the screen there is a car test dummy. The images they would have been seeing were actual car crash victims. The method they used, it was a laboratory experiment. So you can see they're going to have had high levels of control, but possibly low ecological validity. Okay, who were their participants? There were 60 psychology undergraduates from New York University. So a reasonable sample size, but you can see that all of their sample is going to be from relatively academic, relatively educated backgrounds, so is going to suffer from ethnocentrism. It was an independent measures design, so all participants were each randomly assigned to one of 3 groups, and I'll talk a bit more about what those groups involved in a second. Okay, so what was the procedure? So they were all seated in a sound shielded room, okay, so no sound coming in, no sound going out, and wired up to a galvanic skin response. Galvanic skin response basically measures electrical conductivity in your skin, and it can be a measure of how much you're sweating. And remember, when you have that increase in adrenaline in response to stress, you will sweat more, and so it's measuring that, and also heart rate monitors. Okay, so these were the 3 conditions. So group 1, the participants here were given actual control over how long they saw each photograph for. So the photograph would appear, they could press a button to terminate how long they saw the photograph for. Okay, so if they saw the photograph, didn't like it, they instantly press a button and it instantly disappears. Okay, there was also a tone that would precede. So before each photograph, a tone would play, so they were prepared, they knew a photograph was about to appear on the screen. Okay, group 2, the participants could not terminate how long they saw the photograph for. Okay, so the photograph would appear, it would stay on screen for a different amount of time depending on the photograph, so some would stay up for a longer time than others, but they didn't know how long it would be and they had no control over turning it off. Okay, but they did know they would be 60 seconds apart, so they knew that every 60 seconds a new photograph is going to appear for a certain amount of time before it disappears, and then another photograph would appear. They were told how long they would see each one for, and that a 10-second warning would precede each photograph. Okay, and that would be a tone that would play. Group 3, they were just told that randomly from time to time they would see photographs and randomly they would hear tones. Okay, so they had no control and no predictability, so they did not know when a photograph was going to appear, they didn't know when a tone was going to appear, so the tone would just kind of randomly come on at various points. It didn't indicate that a photograph was about to be shown. Okay, and the photographs would just pop up for unpredictable amounts of time and unpredictable time intervals. Okay, what did they find out? Oh, just a couple of points to add actually. A bit more detail about the procedure, sorry. So instructions were read out over the intercom, okay, and after 1 minute's rest the stimuli was presented. Okay, so as mentioned, each photograph was preceded by a 10-second tone and then flashed up. And when the button was pressed in group 1 or after a preset length of time, if they were in group 2 or group 3, the photograph would disappear. Okay, now in terms of when they took the galvanic skin response recordings, they were taken at the start of the tone, of each tone, excuse me, during the second half of the tone, and then in response to the photograph. So they're taking 3 measures of each tone or photograph. Okay, and then they compared that to their baseline scan, which was taken before the photographs, before the experiment actually began, once they'd been wired up initially. Okay, so what did they find? First of all, the heart rate monitors were highly inaccurate. They didn't seem to record the heart rates very well, and therefore they discarded that data because they thought that wasn't fair to compare it when it may not have been picking up accurate data. But group 2, so this was the group who had no control over how long they saw the photographs for, but it was the predictability group, because they knew when the photographs were coming and how long the photographs were going to be shown for. They actually showed the highest level of stress with the tone. Okay, basically as that tone started, they knew what was coming, but they could do absolutely nothing to stop what was coming, and they knew that they would have to look at that photograph for as long as it was determined that photograph would be shown. Group 1, who had control, experienced the least stress, okay, in response to the photographs. So basically, Group 1 had the least amount of stress because they had the control, they could stop the photograph, and they knew they had that control to be able to stop the photograph if they found it unpleasant. Group 3, where they didn't have any control, but also they didn't know when a photograph was coming, so that stress couldn't build up in anticipation with the tone in the same way as it could on Group 2. And Group 2, as I said, experienced the highest stress when they knew the photograph was coming, and that tone would play to indicate a photograph was about to be coming, and that would start to elicit the stress response for them. So what did they conclude? They conclude that it's likely that having the control to terminate, to stop aversive, that means unpleasant stimuli, reduces the stressful impact of those stimuli. So this does seem to be providing support for the idea that a lack of control does cause stress, although obviously this is for a very specific situation, a specific type of thing, but it does seem to be shown that a lack of control increases stress. Obviously you need to be thinking about evaluation points, though. Things to think about include the sample, ethics, the methodology, okay, objectivity, subjectivity, the validity, think about the type of data they collected, ecological validity, and the levels of control. Some of those things are going to be strengths, some of those things are going to be weaknesses, some of them might come into both. In terms of our debates, this very much goes into a situational explanation because it's talking about the factors in our environment lead to stress, although you would need to think about more generally the lack of control could be put down to an individual explanation rather than situational, but this particular experiment goes for very much the situational explanation. Now, just to check that you've all actually watched this, you'll need to pause the video now because you need to have a go at answering these 3 quick questions, and please make sure you bring your answers into the lesson with you. So give an example of a situation where a lack of control has caused you stress. So can you actually think of an example there? Number 2, give 1 weakness of the sample used in the Geer and Meisel study. And question 3, why did Group 3 show less stress with the tone than Group 2? Okay.
Always look on the bright side of life. Always look on the light.